Oh.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks. I forgot to record it before. Carolyn just reminded me, so we'll get the second half. Carolyn, why don't you go ahead and finish up? I think you have a few more slides here, and then we can open it up to other discussion.
Okay. Resume sharing. Okay, cool. So these, so I just mentioned Boyer Slough and the nutrient impacts it has. And so here is some actual data from Boyer Slough from our water quality monitoring program. And so as Steve mentioned, we've been monitoring the water quality around the lake for 10 years. And so here are all of our sites that we monitored in the past. And this is how you'd see it on our website. It's on a logarithmic scale on the left. So it's easier to view individual dots. But you can see here's Boyer's Slough, and it's way above all the others for average phosphorus levels. But you can also see Morton Slough and Cocolala Slough have high phosphorus levels, showing that sloughs often have higher nutrient levels due to the low flow rates and just the amount of vegetation that's in those areas. And then the other high one is their Sandpoint wastewater outfall, or SPWWOF. And so that's close to the outfall for the Sandpoint wastewater treatment plant. So there's nutrients coming from there as well. Boyer Slough is just a double hit. It has a wastewater outfall site as well as a slough. And then there's agricultural areas north of the outlet. But anyway, so here's what it looks like on a logarithmic scale. Here's what it looks like on a normal scale. And so you can see Boyer Slough isn't even on, the average isn't even on the graph. And so when I zoom out far enough to show the most of the dots on Boyer Slough, there's still a few outliers that I wasn't able to fit on the graph, but you're able to see just how far above all the other sites that we monitor it is for phosphorus levels. So it's super impaired, it's super sensitive to our algae blooms and overgrowth of plants that can cause it. And so this is just how our data can really be useful and helpful in monitoring nutrient levels and kind of tying connections between phosphorus levels and algae blooms. Next up is Chuck Slough. And so these are some pictures that I took after my bike ride. And Chuck Slough is, if you're familiar, if you drive on Pine Street, going to Pine Street Woods, you drive on the railroad bridge. It's that kind of slough that comes up from the Pend Oreille River. And it had this horrible discolored green color along the shoreline. It had all this scum along the sides and then mats on the surface. It had, when you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there's algae growth along the sides, but there's also just this horrible, horrible like tea color of the water. And so it just looked horrible. I took as many pictures as I could. I sent them to DEQ and they reported as a health advisory a few days later. So it's just kind of, again, showing that DEQ isn't constantly monitoring all the water bodies within their jurisdiction. And it's really up to citizens like us to notice things like this and report them so that they can collect data, that they can warn the public, that they can take action and kind of implement remediation strategies, hopefully. And then finally, a common question that we got this summer was how long do they last? And unfortunately, it's really hard to determine how long they last. It's based on the weather, whether or not there's still nutrients being loaded into the water body, depends on the time of the year, the habitat of the site, and then again, the flow, so how much is flushing. And so what DEQ told me was that most of these harmful algae blooms that we're seeing at our watershed will go away when we start seeing rain again and when the weather cools down. So kind of a day like today. Unfortunately, on November 2nd, so a couple days ago, it was the end of the recreational season. And so DEQ stopped monitoring all of their sites since the risk of a interaction between someone recreating on the water and a harmful algae bloom has decreased. They were also just so incredibly busy just in the North Idaho region, which is this purple area in the picture. DEQ staff spent together over 500 hours communicating and monitoring and going out to sites. And it was just, they were all completely overworked and stressed out. And one thing that we're trying to do is advocate for DEQ to implement a full-time harmful algae bloom program so that this staff can actually focus on other work that needs to be implemented. And over there, more on the slide, the Priest Lake outlet was within our county. And so that's the one green dot on the map. And the health advisory was enacted on August 27th and then lifted on September 10th. And so that was one of the 4 out of the 25 across the state that was actually lifted during the recreational season. However, the Sago Slough and Comeback Bay was one of the earliest harmful algae blooms we had within our region. And so here we are, was it 3 months later, and they never actually lifted the harmful algae bloom and the health advisory warning. And so one thing that DEQ monitors to determine whether or not it's still present is cell density. And so they do this by collecting water samples and doing lab analysis, or they can use satellite imagery to determine whether or not there might be a potential bloom. And so this is really fascinating. It's new technology that NASA is actually helping a lot of water-based agencies use to kind of monitor and look out for harmful algae blooms. And so it's just kind of showing some of the techniques that they're using to try and prevent them and monitor them and stay on top of them. And then,
Carolyn?
yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
How does lowering the level of the lake affect the algae blooms? Does it contribute to them, to their growth, or does it dry them out? Or can you speak of that at all?
Yeah, well, I think we noticed with our monitoring program that the lake started drawing down the weekend before our last monitoring date. And you can kind of compare turbidity and nutrient levels between our sites and between our sloughs, and especially with Boyer Slough, which actually had algae bloom. And the lake being drawn down increased the flow throughout the lake, so that that helped remediate some of the algae blooms. It helped kind of take care of them, so to say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So now how can we prevent harmful algae blooms? And so the best thing to do that is to prevent the addition of excess nutrients. And so there's a bunch of ways that you can do that. So you can reduce your use of fertilizer in your lawn or in your crops. You can increase riparian vegetation. You can restore wetlands. One of the other major contributing factors to algae blooms is temperature. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of contributors to climate change and global warming. So reduce your carbon footprint and try and reduce the impacts of global warming. But one of the more doable actions that you can do is prevent the excess nutrients from entering the water body. And so I'm going to go over a couple of different controls that are being put in place. And I mentioned earlier that we have really healthy water bodies here in North Idaho. And so only a few of these are really used in the non-regulatory controls. Whereas areas kind of in the Midwest and East where harmful algae blooms have been happening for a really long time and can be a lot more detrimental, they kind of implement some stronger and stricter controls. However, across the whole US, the Clean Water Act is one of the biggest tools that we use with the Waterkeeper Alliance to ensure that federal, local, state agencies are all doing their part and following the law to protect our water bodies and to keep them clean and safe for generations to come. And so out of the Clean Water Act came total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, and those kind of determine the maximum amount of nutrients that can be added to a water body, well, so it can still meet water quality standards. So based on the beneficial uses, such as if it's a drinking water source, if it's economic growth and recreation. And so Lake Pend Oreille actually has a near shore waters TMDL for phosphorus due to algae blooms that were happening in the 90s. And so the state agencies such as DEQ uses monitoring to ensure that municipalities and local water bodies are staying within the TMDL limits that are set under Clean Water Act standards. And so it's a lot of big words and a lot of paperwork that's done, but it really does help improve and ensure that our water bodies are staying clean and not getting worse. And if they are, they can be a lot more strict with allowing NPDES permits, which is National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. And so like an NPDES permit would be allocated to a wastewater treatment plant to determine how many pollutants they're allowed to discharge into the water, and just kind of keeping them in check and ensuring that they monitor what pollutants and how many they're discharging into the water, whether or not they're in violation of the TMDL or the Clean Water Act. And so it's really helping ensure that agencies and corporations are held accountable for their actions and not polluting our shared natural resources. And so these are really important, and we use these a lot here at the Waterkeeper to make sure that our water body is staying clean and to determine kind of sources of nutrient pollutions, whether or not they're active or potential. Non-regulatory controls. So a big one is public education and outreach. So you're doing a really good job. You're coming to one of our outreach educational activities, so you can learn about what a harmful algae bloom is. You can teach others. You can spread the word. You can also use signs. So at water bodies that may have a harmful algae bloom, you can install signs to say, hey, stay out of the water. This is why. This is what happened. This is what it looks like. This is what can. These are the impacts. And then bioremediation. And so that's stuff like wetland remediation, wetland restoration, and then making sure that there's still riparian vegetation. And so if you look at the picture here on the bottom, you can kind of compare the left and right. So the left is what we kind of define as a more healthy aquatic ecosystem. There's a lot of vegetation that's helping to cool the water. It's filtering nutrients out from runoff that may enter the water body. It's encouraging habitat for fish. And then on the right, there's an agricultural area. There's a tractor that's plowing almost all the way to the shoreline, probably applying pesticides and herbicides at the back that then run off with very little shoreline vegetation, filtering it out, entering the water body, polluting the water, maybe killing off the fish and causing algae blooms. And so this is just like a classic diagram of kind of what we want to encourage and what we want to discourage. And then on the right is an example of watershed modeling and research. And so this kind of shows different land use areas within a watershed. This is over on the East Coast, but it shows whether or not the area is highly developed or if it's forested, if it's agricultural. And so this is really important for agencies that enact TMDLs and NPDES permits, determining what the potential impacts may be on a water body. So if there's a lot of agricultural areas, they may estimate that there's a bunch of fertilizer, herbicides, and pesticides that are potentially polluting the water. If there's a bunch of forest land, impacts could be from logging, as you mentioned earlier, Jane. But there's also potentially, hopefully, more vegetation that prevents runoff and erosion. If there's urban areas surrounding the water body, urban stormwater could be a really huge impact. So just kind of helping agencies determine where the pollutants might come from and what they might be. And then finally, there are some physical and chemical control measures that may be put in place. And so one physical control measure may be mixing the water, so oxygenating it or putting in an aerator. And so that helps mix the water, and it kind of helps increase the flow and just tries to flush the algae out of the system. There are some chemical control measures that may be implemented. I unfortunately didn't really do that much research into them, but basically it's what they might use in a wastewater treatment plant to coagulate and flocculate the algae bloom, causing it to die prematurely, which then still might cause hypoxic conditions. And so I'm not sure I'm a huge advocate for that one, but that's one that I haven't heard of being implemented in our area. In our area, we just kind of let them run their course. And then, oopsie. Okay, so here's what you can do. The first step that you're doing tonight, which is really important, is to learn what HABs are and what they look like. Algae, as I said before, is a natural part of surface water systems. They often talk about the stick and jar test. So if you can pick up algae with a stick, It's kind of the filamentous algae. It's usually not a harmful algae. The harmful algae can often create this pea soup color that we see in Boyer Slough. This picture of Boyer Slough from the previous summer, you can see all the duckweed, which is a non-harmful algae that's gathered around the sides. However, it's still preventing light from penetrating. It's not classified as a harmful algae bloom because it's not releasing toxins. However, it can still harm the organisms that live in them. Anyway, so what else you can do is you can teach others what harmful algae blooms are. And so spread the word if you see one, maybe tell others about it and be, hey, I heard that Boyer Slough is a harmful algae bloom. They can go, what is that? You can go, oh, I learned all about it at this Waterkeeper presentation from Carolyn. And you can read her article that was in the Reader, that's on their website, yada, yada. And you can do research about what they are, why they're harmful, and then you can kind of teach them how they can prevent nutrient pollution. So planting a rain garden, volunteering when you restore wetlands and repair riparian vegetation, not using very much fertilizer on your lawn, if at all. And then a next step is reporting potential blooms. So this is really, really important if we want to continue to monitor and gather data about what's happening in our watershed. So the most important thing is to take pictures. If you call us and you say that, hey, the water's really green, the first thing that we're gonna ask is for you to text us or email us pictures. Because without those, it's really hard to kind of communicate the color of the water and what it looks like. So you can call our pollution hotline that's listed there. You can email us, you can get in touch with us on our website, or you can get in touch with us via social media. You can prevent nutrient pollution, as I said before, by planting a rain garden, encouraging riparian buffers and shoreline vegetative buffers, preventing nutrient pollution from entering our waterways. Don't litter, pick up trash before it enters our waterways. Here's another plug for our shoreline cleanup this Saturday. It'll be really fun. And then you can advocate for clean water. Clean water is a human right. Lake Pend Oreille is our drinking water source. It's huge for our area as an economic driver, as a recreational area. It's a beautiful, beautiful Grand Lake. And then finally, you can become an LPOW member. You can support our mission to keep Lake Pend Oreille clean for generations to come, and spread the word. So that's the end of my presentation. We're gonna have a short survey after we're done, and then here's our website, our phone, and
I have one more question, Carolyn.
okay, yeah.
What about livestock? I'm always thinking about when I go to Clark Fork, the Delta area from the drift yard towards the town of Clark Fork. There's a lot of water there that's really eutrophied pretty significantly. And it's partly because there've been livestock, cattle and horses right along the shoreline for a long time. I reported it too many times and nobody did anything about it. This is prior to the Waterkeeper, but you know, now you couldn't, a heron or a goose couldn't even land in that area. It's so thick with pond lilies and others, but I used to see hundreds of waterfowl in those areas. So does Waterkeeper monitor livestock impacts?
I don't believe that we monitor livestock impacts. Livestock can be impacted by harmful algae blooms. However, I guess we just don't see them very often in our watershed. I haven't heard of any livestock kills due to harmful algae blooms. I don't know about you.
Concerned about their effluent more than because they're peeing and pooping right along the water shoreline. So I really have watched that area over the years, and it is beyond comeback now. It's eutrophied to a degree that it'll never come back, I'm afraid. Just curious.
I wanted to just chime in on that a little bit. I appreciate you mentioning that, Jane. I did have a phone call a couple of weeks ago from a gentleman who was interested in understanding if the county Department of Lands or anybody had any regulations regarding the proximity in which livestock could be towards open water here in our area and or sort of housed in. Unfortunately, we came up empty. And there is not a county reg anywhere that prohibits or suggests or has some sort of buffer between livestock. And so this is one of the things that we're constantly running into these new problems and having to go back to the county and try and figure out, well, this doesn't seem quite right. Is there anything that we can do to sort of?
Yeah, I think my memory, because it's been a few years since because I don't live on that end of the world anymore. But it was the Soil Conservation Service that I was told to contact, and I think you're right, Steve. I don't think there were regulations, but I just wondered about the TMDL, if that had any impact whatsoever on shoreline. But I think it was trying to talk to landowners just to point out to them what they're doing with their livestock. And but I just never got anywhere. It was just.
No, that's a difficult one. A couple things I wanted to mention that just on Carolyn's presentation in terms of harmful or the potential for harm. I talked to Bob Steed down at DEQ, and he said Hayden Lake was just a disaster this year, and not only did, as Carolyn mentioned, did 4 dogs sort of die in the area from getting in the water, but there was a whole house full of teenagers that rented a vacation home on Hayden Lake and were drinking water out of the hose, which was actually coming right from the lake, and they all got really sick. So and I want to just kind of piggyback a little bit. We have everybody's contact information. I'm hoping that's here. A thing that Carolyn mentioned about the exorbitant amount of effort that DEQ has put into the algae bloom, harmful algae bloom situation throughout the state has completely consumed an entire division down there in Coeur d'Alene this year. It's really a problem. We've been sort of asked to come to poke them, the upper administration, as Carolyn said, to really fund an entire department for this, because they've been supposedly going to turn around and write a specific TMDL for Boyer Slough, so that we can be in good shape when the Kootenai Ponderay Sewer District is reapplying for their permit, and they just don't have the manpower. So we're going to draft up a little letter. We're going to send it in. Maybe we can if they got just another half a dozen letters down there or something that sort of identified the same issue, I think that we could go a long way into getting them some additional support. So does anybody else have any questions on this particular topic or any other, and then we can go into other topics if people want to continue to have a conversation. Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to talk about, Jane's comment was, I know that it's been encouraged in other places where livestock are there, to have like a solar powered pump to pump water to a pond that's away from a creek or river, and fence off the area to keep the livestock away from the water, but still give them a drinking pond somewhere farther inland or farther away from the water. And there's no regulation apparently, but it's still a good idea, and everybody should encourage farmers and ranchers to do that sort of thing.
That's a good point. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I might just talk a little bit about the fact that our water quality monitoring program is strictly in the lake at this point. Our sampling sites are strictly in the lake. And in fact, a lot of what impacts the lake is taking place in the watershed. We've talked about ag inputs, we've talked about livestock, we've mentioned forestry impacts, the whole works. And until we actually get in and start monitoring some of the main tributaries to the lake, or even some of the smaller tributaries that are impacted by these things, we really don't have a good handle on where the nutrient loading is coming to the lake. And Pat, with regard to your comments about water sources for livestock, yeah, right now it's free run. They can go directly into the go directly into the water and drink, and even a simple program that would fence off all but a small portion of the stream and harden that with gravel or something like that. I've seen this work in New Zealand. It can have a tremendous impact on keeping the riparian zone intact, acting as a filter, and eliminating a lot of the inputs. That's true for forestry and ag inputs as well. So I think the realization that what actually happens to the lake is influenced by what happens in the many small tributaries and rivers that are coming into it is actually more important probably than monitoring the lake water itself. It's my 2 cents.
Appreciate it. Anybody else have anything? Preston, I see it looks like you're leaning in.
Yeah, I have a question. My cat's about to eat my dinner. No. Is there any way those of us who are sampling in the sloughs, like my wife and I are in Morton Slough, if we see anything, is there any way we can sample and expedite the analysis for DEQ, so they don't have to come out, and is there any way we can include that with our sampling program?
I don't think so.
Hey, Ed, Steve,
Yeah,
I think within our volunteer guide, there is a cyanobacteria protocols put in place. But I don't know the last time we actually used it.
I mean, that's a good question, and we'll verify with Kristen, but I think they're pretty particular about, they have to put out a health advisory. And so I think they need to come up, and they were actually really responsive in terms of the timing. Like, we would call them, they'd be there the next day.
I think that the deal is, Preston, that our volunteer water quality monitoring is considered a tier 2 effort. And in order to issue an advisory like that, it needs to be tier 1. The only reason that it's tier 2 is because the people who are actually collecting the water are not paid. You and I are not paid, unfortunately. And so if we were paid and went through the QA protocols and that sort of thing, we might be able to do it. But I think that's, the short of it is that it needs to be a staff member who's paid from an agency in order for them to issue that kind of regulation, with all of the chain of custody work that needs to be done with the samples and that sort of thing.
Okay, I understand that. And just my experience on Morton Slough for a few years, I've never seen, I've seen a little bit of algae, but never anything like what those pictures are. And I don't know what Kokolala Slough looks like.
I sampled Kokolala for a couple of years, and I've never seen anything like that either. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in December, we're going to go through some of the results that we've seen over the years. And one of the things that's definitely true is that this year the temperatures at all of the sites in July and August were really elevated. And for those of you who've studied any biology at all, there's a Q10 relationship, which means that for every 10 degrees Celsius change in temperature, you get a doubling of biological activity. So, that's probably one of the reasons, one of the drivers for a lot of the algae growth we saw this year as well, was the increased temperatures.
Well, I have go ahead, Pat.
One more, just a comment about sampling, that Boyer Slough being so bad. is there a plan in place to maybe add 1 or 2 monitoring stations farther upstream? So you can kind of see where the bad stuff is really coming in, or do you just know that's from the wastewater plant?
We know it. We know it
Okay.
already. We're up there as pretty much as high as we can get. And Carolyn and I went out and visited the Kootenai-Ponderay Sewer District Treatment Plant. I don't know, maybe it was in the spring. And we went out and you can basically, they say that it discharges into an unnamed tributary to Boyer Slough, when really it is the only thing that is making the tributary is the discharge from the sewer treatment plant. So it basically just discharges out into a little drainage ditch and then goes right into the slough. So we know where it's coming from.
Yeah,
But
okay.
go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say, given that those high temperatures from the summer and everything we know about climate change and maybe the new normal, it seems to me that you could put a lot more pressure on the Kootenai-Ponderay municipalities to say, hey, look, this is not good. That's an area of growth and development. I don't know. It just seems like.
No, you're right. We're working on it. I mean, we're developing a strategy to, take another look at regionalizing, the wastewater system here, in the county between city of Sandpoint, Schweitzer, Kootenai-Ponderay, and Sagal. And if we can get those, we're pretty convinced that wastewater discharges into the lake probably are like the single biggest threat to water quality over the next 25 to 50 years. So we're putting a major effort into it. Have been for the last few months. We're getting, we're trying to assemble the people at the table. I think I got more than half of them willing to sit and engage in it again. So yeah, we're working on it. We have all you science people still online. I had a little bit of a, Carolyn and I came into the office today and we were going over her presentation, and I started kind of looking at the data and I was thinking, okay, what can we really do about these algae blooms? Okay, it's the nutrients. We got to keep the nutrients, right? We got to keep phosphorus around. That's what we always keep hearing, right? And so then I'd look at the data for Boyer Slough, and the phosphorus is like off the chart, right? And we had warm temperatures, and so you go like, oh, okay, high phosphorus. And I was going like, is there any number, like what's the number that we need to get our phosphorus down to where we can safely say, okay, well, this body of water is not really going to be susceptible to an algae bloom, so that we have a target to work for, right? So then we go over to Comeback Bay and Fry Creek, and we look at the phosphorus levels that we had over there from the data that we took from 2 years ago. And granted, it was from 2 years ago, and so it might have had a significant change, but that phosphorus level was below the requirement. It was below the 0.9, whatever the factor is. I'm not up on that part of it. And then you go to Morton Slough, where Preston's at, and you got phosphorus off the chart. You got the same temperatures. You got no algae bloom in Morton Slough. You got an algae bloom in Fry Creek that has low phosphorus. And then you got a massive algae bloom in Boyer Slough that's off the chart. And so, how much of a factor really is that? And is that something that we're really, can one of you guys comment on that kind of thing?
I was going to ask about nitrogen levels.
Yeah.
Nitrate levels, how that plays in.
We'd have to go to our website right now and check it out. I don't know.
No, I think that I think Preston, you raised a good point, is that it's not strictly phosphorus that's driving these things. There are other elements as well, including the soluble forms of nitrogen that are at play here. And
would that be
we monitor some of those.
Would that be something that one of you guys, who's familiar with the monitoring program, kind of go back and take a look at, like what you think those other factors are, so that we could kind of create, if we can come up with a pattern there or some sort of, plausible explanation for why it's happening here and not happening there, and this is what we should do over here. I think that would go a long way for helping us
Yeah.
communicate.
The other thing is flushing rates, how the water is moving through the various sloughs or backwaters, whatever. I think that was one of the advantages of Coquilala Slough, is that it has a pretty good flow rate through there, coming out of Round Lake and Coquilala Lake. So there's a movement in there, a current in there that flushes that out that you don't see in some of the other sloughs. I think Preston Morton Slough probably doesn't have that same flushing rate that Coquilala does, although it may have some. I've never been back in that slough, so I'm not sure. At any rate, yeah, Steve, we can take a look at some of those and see if there's something that jumps out that might help to explain it. But remember that that's what the basis of TMDLs is, to define a limit that a particular water body can handle, in the way handle in quotes, for the various nutrients that are impacting a particular water body. That's the basis of a TMDL.
Right.
And so that is a level. It's not in terms of a concentration, it's more of a loading rate, but and what we're measuring are concentrations.
Right, and that only comes into play when they apply for an MPDES discharge permit. And so,
yeah, well, it should take into consideration flow rates as well. I mean, setting a TMDL is not as easy as going out and grabbing a sample and analyzing it for a concentration.
Yeah, I get that. Okay, does anybody else have anything on this, or any other questions, general questions about other things that we might be doing, or where we're headed, or any of that?
No, just thank you, Carolyn, for the presentation.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. I have a question about how much runoff from the parks or the schools that use fertilizer would affect the storm water coming down through town. And like right now, there's so many leaves and pine needles that get into the storm sewers, and that must cause some issues because it doesn't all get filtered before it gets into the lake. And I realize it's coming into winter now, but I know that when I taught science at the middle school, we talked about people not dumping their oil down the drain when they change their oil, because it ends up 1 quart of oil spread how many acres? 2 or 3 acres on top of the surface of the water. So
it's an interesting topic, because I was in Sandpoint yesterday. I live in Bonners Ferry, and I noticed all the people were raking their leaves into the gutters to be picked up by the city. Well, now we've got a bunch of rain that's fallen on how many of those leaves ended up down in the stormwater system. So, that's obviously going to be an input to the lake. And all of those contain nutrients, as they decompose, they're going to release nutrients to the various water bodies that they end up in. Not a great practice to rake your leaves into the gutter this time of year. But then you do have the fertilizer issue as well, and one of the things that I will say for the Waterkeeper is that we are very cognizant of the issue of stormwater runoff from city streets and lawns and parks and that sort of thing. And we haven't done a great job over the years in monitoring stormwater runoff, and it's not a particularly easy thing to do because you have to anticipate a snowmelt event or a rainfall event or whatever, and have people who can go out and grab the samples. But it is nonetheless, it's an important, essentially point source input to the lake. And so we're aware of it. We're working with DEQ to get funding to do some more limited types of sampling, and there are all sorts of chemicals that are coming off of our streets and getting into the lake. And we really don't have a good handle on the exact quantities. And part of the problem with stormwater monitoring is that in addition to the concentration of a particular element, you also need to know the flow rate, how much water is coming out of each pipe. And that adds a whole nother dimension to the sampling program, because how do you, I mean, there are techniques obviously of measuring flow rates in pipes and that sort of thing. Usually it involves equipment purchases and installation. And that's, at this point, it's beyond our funding level within the Waterkeeper to do that type of measurement, but we can sample and get concentrations.
I guess I was also thinking about the educational aspect. The city wants us to rake our leaves into the street because they won't pick them up if they're on the lawn. However, they could encourage us to leave 6 inches, 10 inches a foot between the curb and the leaves for runoff. You know, like before the leaves are out in the street, there's so many pine needles. If residents realize that all they need to do is sweep once in a while, because our street sweepers don't always come around, but so maybe some education around the runoff, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think I think we can broach that with them, and you know, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how, I had no idea, you know, personally, you know, admittedly, that raking leaves into the gutter had anything to do with stormwater quality. So happy to broach that. I think the city in general is paying attention to stormwater. I mean, we were really disappointed that the lot tax did not pass, because this is going to postpone the construction of the stormwater filtration system that they had planned for the farm and landing improvement there. And so I'm a little fearful that we could lose that because it's an expensive system, but it's an important one. When they rerouted the First Avenue and Cedar Street, they actually like combined several stormwater systems. So where there were 2, there's only 1 now. And that actually, the current outfall covers a 28-acre section of downtown. And so if we would have been able to get a high-tech filter down there right before it dumps into Sand Creek, right behind the Panada Theater there, we would have gone a long way with just that one project to be able to filter stormwater. And them adopting that sort of technology, which is sort of a concrete vault that has a cartridge inside of it, that has a media inside the cartridge that actually filters the water. So, and they're, you know, supposedly phenomenal at removing, you know, nutrients. And if they were to get that one project in there, then they could systematically go around and start to put in individual catch basins. When they replace a catch basin or tear up a street, they can just plop one of these, a single smaller unit right down in. So I'm hoping that, you know, they take another run at the tax maybe next year, give themselves a little bit more time for people to lobby for it and educate people. But, you know, that's a good point. Thank you for the comment, Linda.
Well, that in itself would make a great little article for the reader or online, just about that water quality aspect of the lot.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good idea, what you said earlier about educating people about the impact that leaf debris and pine needles can have on water quality and adding nutrients to our water bodies. And that's a really good idea, because education and, you know, spreading the word and spreading awareness is like the first step.
And people that throw their cigarette butts into the street, oh, and then they go down the drain.
Yeah.
Well, and I also like what Linda brought up. I mean, I'm thinking like Chuck Slough on Pine Street and the Traverse Park's sports fields. and all of the fertilizer they use and all of the herbicides, because they keep that grass. And it all runs into Chuck Slough. I mean, it
That's a good,
runs into, so, you know, that's, I hadn't really thought about that, Linda. So that's a good thing to bring up.
right. Good point. Okay, anybody
Thank-
else have
thank-
anything?
Thank you.
Thank you for all you do. Thank you.
And
Bye, gotta go.
thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks.
And just a final plug, we're gonna have our shoreline cleanup on Saturday at City Beach from 10 to 1, and I'd love to see everyone there. There's gonna be free coffee and free donuts. And
Hi,
I'm just
Carolyn.
hi Tippy. And I just sent a message to the group chat. It's a post event survey that we would really appreciate you guys taking and let us know how we did. Me and Steve are really bummed that we're holding this via Zoom. We really wish we could be in person, but we really just don't want to risk spreading COVID and hosting an event due to the conditions. And we're not sure when we're going to be able to do this in person again. So we want to make these the best that they can be. And so any input is welcomed. And again, sign up for email newsletters, get in touch with us, call us if you have any more questions. And thanks again for coming. And next month, we're going to be talking about our water quality monitoring program and our data. So tune in next month. Thanks
Thanks,
again.
everybody. Have a great night. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank
Thanks, Matt.
you.
Night, everybody.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job, Carolyn.